Go outside right now. Walk to the oldest flower pot in your garden, the one that has been sitting in the same place for months, maybe years. Lift it carefully. Beneath it, you will probably find them. Small, gray, armored, moving in every direction at once. And the moment the light touches them, some will instantly curl themselves into perfect little balls. Most people barely think about them. Some step on them. Others assume they are pests. After all, anything living beneath a garden pot must be there because something is wrong, right? Too much moisture, too much decay, too much neglect. At least that is what most people believe. But before you put that pot back down, there is something I need you to understand. Those tiny creatures beneath your flower pots may be among the hardest working animals in your entire garden. Not insects, not worms, not bees, not butterflies. Something far stranger. In fact, if every one of them disappeared from your yard tonight, your soil would begin changing almost immediately. Leaves would decompose more slowly. Nutrients would cycle less efficiently. Certain toxins would remain trapped in the ground longer than they should. And the invisible machinery that keeps healthy soil alive would lose one of its most important workers. Which is strange because almost nobody talks about them. Nobody hangs pictures of them. Nobody builds gardens specifically to attract them. Most people do not even know their real name. They simply call them roly-polies. And that name comes from the single behavior everyone remembers. Touch one, it rolls into a ball. Simple. Cute, maybe. A little strange, but certainly not remarkable. At least, that is what I thought for most of my life. Then I learned something that completely changed the way I looked at them. The roly-poly is not an insect, not even close. The first time I heard that fact, I assumed it was a mistake. How could something living in garden soil not be an insect? It has a hard shell, lots of legs, lives under rocks, looks exactly like what most people imagine when they hear the word bug. But science says otherwise. The creature hiding beneath your flower pots belongs to a completely different branch of the animal kingdom. The roly-poly is a crustacean, a relative of shrimp, a relative of crabs, a relative of lobsters. Read that again. One of the most common animals in your garden is more closely related to the seafood on a restaurant menu than it is to ants, beetles, or grasshoppers. And once you know that, everything about it starts to make more sense. Look closely at its body, the segmented armor, the overlapping plates, the shape of its shell, the way it moves. Suddenly, it does not look like an insect anymore. It looks like something that came from another world, or more accurately, another environment. Because millions of years ago, the ancestors of modern roly-polies lived in the ocean, long before gardens existed, long before humans existed. Long before flowers grew in backyard pots, their ancestors crawled across ancient seafloors. They breathed underwater. They belonged to a world of tides and salt water. Then something extraordinary happened. A small group of those ancient crustaceans began moving onto land. It was one of the most difficult transitions in evolutionary history. Everything had to change. The way they breathed, the way they reproduced, the way they avoided drying out, the way they survived. Most animals never managed such a transition. These did. And even today, millions of years later, they still carry evidence of where they came from. That is why roly-polies love dark, damp places. It is not because they are hiding from you. It is because part of their biology still belongs to the sea. On the underside of their bodies are structures that function much like modified gills. Those structures need moisture. Without it, they cannot breathe properly. This is why lifting a flower pot often reveals dozens of them gathered together. You are not discovering a random collection of bugs. You are discovering descendants of marine animals still searching for the moisture their ancestors depended on millions of years ago. And yet, this is only the beginning of the story, because surviving on land was not their greatest achievement. Their greatest achievement was finding a job that almost no other animal wanted: eating death. Not fresh plants, not flowers, not healthy roots. Death. Dead leaves, rotting wood, decaying stems, fallen plant material. Things most creatures ignore. Every healthy garden produces enormous amounts of waste, Leaves fall, plants die, branches break, flowers wither. If nothing removed this material, it would simply accumulate, layer after layer, year after year. But nature hates waste, and the roly-poly became one of nature's recyclers. Night after night, hidden beneath darkness, they emerge from under stones, logs, and flower pots to begin feeding. Not on your garden, on what your garden leaves behind. They break down material that would otherwise sit untouched. They chew it into smaller pieces. They process it, transform it, return it to the soil. Most gardeners never see this happening because the work takes place while nobody is looking. The healthiest systems in nature often do. When people think about a thriving garden, they imagine flowers, butterflies, birds, perhaps bees. Almost nobody imagines an army of tiny gray crustaceans working beneath the soil surface. Yet without decomposers like these, the entire system begins to slow down. Nutrients remain locked inside dead material. Soil loses efficiency. The cycle weakens. Which means that every time you find a cluster of roly-polies beneath a flower pot, you are not looking at a problem. You are looking at a maintenance crew. An ancient workforce that has been recycling organic matter for millions of years. And somehow, that is still not the most remarkable thing they do. Because hidden inside these tiny armored bodies is a biological ability so unusual that scientists are still studying it today. An ability that allows them to do something most animals cannot. Something that turns them into living environmental filters. And once researchers discovered it, they began seeing roly-polies in a completely different way. The discovery happened almost by accident. For decades, scientists studying polluted soils noticed something strange. In areas contaminated by industry, vehicle emissions, old construction materials, and decades of human activity, certain toxic metals seem to disappear from the soil faster than expected. Not completely, but enough to raise questions. Lead, cadmium, copper, zinc, elements that should have remained available in the environment were showing up somewhere else. The answer, surprisingly, was crawling beneath their feet. Roly-polies were eating them. Not intentionally, of course. The metals entered their bodies mixed with decaying leaves, fragments of wood, and tiny particles of soil. But once inside, something extraordinary happened. Instead of allowing these toxic materials to circulate freely through their tissues, roly-polies began locking them away. Scientists eventually discovered specialized cells capable of isolating heavy metals and storing them in mineralized deposits inside the body. Think about what that means. Every night, while these tiny crustaceans crawl through your garden feeding on dead organic matter, they are also removing certain contaminants from the environment around them. Not because they evolved to help humans, not because they understand pollution, simply because millions of years of evolution accidentally equipped them with a biological system that happens to perform a task modern environmental scientists find incredibly useful. The creature most people step on without a second thought is quietly running part of a natural filtration system beneath their garden. And this reveals something fascinating about nature. The most important workers are often the ones nobody notices. Nobody celebrates fungi for breaking down dead trees. Nobody thanks earthworms for turning soil. Nobody admires bacteria for recycling nutrients. And almost nobody appreciates the roly-poly. Yet entire ecosystems depend on work happening at this level, not the visible level, the invisible one, the layer beneath the flowers, beneath the grass, beneath the garden pots, the layer where death slowly becomes life again. But there is another mystery surrounding the roly-poly that most people have wondered about since childhood. Why does it roll into a ball? At first glance, the answer seems obvious: protection. And that is true. But the deeper you look, the more impressive the behavior becomes. Most animals have obvious weak points: soft tissue, exposed joints, vulnerable areas predators can target. The roly-poly solved that problem in an extraordinary way. Its body is built like a biological puzzle. Each armor plate overlaps precisely with the next. When danger appears, the animal pulls its legs inward, folds its body, and locks the plates together. Within seconds, it transforms from a vulnerable creature into something resembling a tiny armored sphere. No exposed legs, no exposed underside, no obvious place to attack. For many predators, it simply becomes too difficult to eat. The strategy is so effective that it has survived for hundreds of millions of years. And it turns out engineers find this just as fascinating as biologists do. Researchers studying impact-resistant structures have examined the roly-poly's rolling mechanism as a source of inspiration. The way its armor distributes force, protects internal components, and changes shape without breaking has influenced ideas in robotics, protective equipment, and deployable engineering systems. Think about that for a moment. The tiny creature hiding beneath your flower pot possesses a structural design sophisticated enough to inspire modern technology. Yet most people never look closely enough to notice. That seems to be the story of the roly-poly. Every time you learn something new about it, the animal becomes stranger and more impressive. First, it turns out not to be an insect. Then it turns out to be a crustacean. Then you discover its ancestors came from the ocean. Then you learn it helps recycle nutrients. Then you find out it can store toxic metals. Then you discover engineers study its armor. Every answer leads to another surprise. And eventually, you begin seeing it differently. Not as a bug, not as a pest, but as the product of an evolutionary journey that began hundreds of millions of years ago and somehow ended beneath a flower pot in your backyard. Which brings us to the question that started this entire story. Why should you never kill the roly-poly under your garden pots? The answer has very little to do with the animal itself, and everything to do with what its presence means. Roly-polies thrive where conditions are healthy. They need moisture, organic matter, shade, active decomposition. The same conditions that support earthworms, fungi, beneficial microbes, and the countless unseen organisms that keep soil alive. A garden full of roly-polies is often a garden full of life. Not the life you immediately notice, the life working underground, the life doing the jobs nobody else wants, the life holding the entire system together. When gardeners discover dozens or hundreds of roly-polies beneath a pot, many assume they are seeing a problem. In reality, they may be seeing evidence that their soil ecosystem is functioning exactly as it should. The animals are not there because something is wrong. They are there because something is right, because moisture remains available, because organic matter is present, because decomposition is happening, because the garden is alive. And perhaps that is the greatest misunderstanding surrounding creatures like these. Humans tend to admire what is large, colorful, beautiful, obvious. Nature often depends on something very different. Tiny workers operating in darkness. Animals nobody photographs. Species most people cannot even name. The roly-poly belongs to that hidden world. A world beneath stones, beneath logs, beneath flower pots. A world where armies of decomposers spend every night transforming yesterday's dead leaves into tomorrow's fertile soil. The next time you lift a flower pot and discover them gathered underneath, pause for a moment before putting the pot back down. Look closely. What appears to be a cluster of insignificant gray creatures is actually something much stranger. You are looking at descendants of ancient marine crustaceans that conquered land, survived mass extinctions, developed biological filtration systems, inspired engineering research, and became some of the most important recyclers in the ecosystem around your home. Not bad for an animal most people mistake for a bug. And when the light disappears and the darkness returns, they will go back to work. Quietly, patiently, without recognition, doing what they have done for millions of years, turning death into life beneath your garden, one tiny piece at a time. So the next time someone reaches for a shoe after spotting a roly-poly beneath a flower pot, remember this. The creature they are about to crush is not a pest. It is a recycler, a filter, an engineer, a survivor. And one of the smallest reasons your garden remains alive. There is one more thing most people never ask when they find dozens of roly-polies beneath the same flower pot. Why are there so many? Lift a stone in a healthy garden after a rainstorm, and you might find 5. Lift an old piece of wood, and you might find 20. But occasionally, you find something stranger. 50, 100, sometimes even more, all crowded together in the same dark space. At first glance, it looks almost unsettling, like an infestation, like something multiplying out of control. But once again, appearances are deceiving. The truth is much simpler and much older. Roly-polies are constantly fighting a battle against dehydration. Remember, these are descendants of marine crustaceans. Their ancestors spent millions of years living underwater, and despite all the adaptations that allowed them to conquer land, they never completely escaped their dependence on moisture. Every minute spent in dry air is a risk. Every hot afternoon is a challenge. Every patch of exposed soil can become dangerous. So when a safe location appears, a place that remains cool, damp, and protected, they gather. Not because they enjoy each other's company, not because they form colonies, but because they have all independently discovered the same thing. Survival is easier there. The flower pot becomes a tiny oasis, a shelter, a refuge from the drying world above. And what seems like a crowd is actually hundreds of individuals making the same decision at the same time. Nature often looks organized when it is really just millions of small survival choices happening simultaneously. But moisture affects more than where they live. It influences how they drink. And this is another place where their ancient history begins to show. Unlike many insects, roly-polies do not simply obtain all their water from food. They actively absorb moisture from their surroundings and rely heavily on human environments to maintain proper biological function. Without sufficient moisture, their respiratory structures begin failing, the same structures that connect them to their distant marine ancestors. Which means that even after hundreds of millions of years on land, part of their biology is still quietly reminding them where they came from. The ocean never completely left them. And perhaps the most surprising reminder of all appears when the next generation arrives. Most people have never seen a baby roly-poly. Not because they are rare, but because they spend the earliest part of their lives hidden from view, inside their mother. Female roly-polies carry their developing young in a fluid-filled brood pouch located beneath their bodies, a structure remarkably similar to what many aquatic crustaceans use. For weeks, the embryos remain protected inside this chamber, surrounded by moisture and nutrients while they develop. Then one day, dozens of miniature versions of the adult emerge, tiny, pale, almost translucent. A new generation of land-dwelling crustaceans, beginning the same journey their ancestors have repeated for millions of years. And when you step back and look at the entire picture, the animal beneath your flower pot begins to feel less like a bug and more like a survivor, a creature that witnessed dramatic climate shifts, mass extinctions, the rise and fall of entire ecosystems, the appearance of dinosaurs, the disappearance of dinosaurs, the emergence of mammals, and eventually the arrival of humans. All while quietly continuing the same job, recycling, filtering, breaking down what is dead so something new can grow. Which raises one final question. What would happen if they disappeared? Imagine walking into your garden tomorrow and discovering that every roly-poly was gone. At first, you probably would not notice anything. The flowers would still bloom. The grass would still grow. The garden would appear exactly the same, for a while. But beneath the surface, changes would already be beginning. Dead leaves would remain intact longer. Decomposition would slow. Nutrients would become trapped inside organic material instead of returning to the soil. The microscopic communities that depend on decomposition would lose one of their most reliable partners. The entire recycling system would become less efficient, not collapse. Nature is rarely dependent on a single species, but weaken. And healthy ecosystems are often defined by thousands of small processes working together. Remove enough of those processes, and eventually the effects become impossible to ignore. This is one of the reasons ecologists pay attention to organisms like roly-polies. Not because they are large, not because they are charismatic, but because they perform functions that help everything else continue working. The flowers get the attention, the decomposers do the work. And perhaps that is why creatures like these are so easy to overlook. They are invisible when things are going well. You only notice their importance when they are gone. The next time you lift a flower pot and discover dozens of tiny armored bodies scattered beneath it, try looking at them differently. Do not see pests. Do not see bugs. Do not even see roly-polies. See descendants of ancient crustaceans that carried the legacy of the ocean onto land. See recyclers transforming death into fertility. See biological filters quietly processing the world beneath your feet. See engineers wearing armor refined through hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Most importantly, see evidence that your garden is alive in ways that have nothing to do with flowers. Because the true foundation of every healthy garden is not what grows above the soil, it is what works beneath it. In darkness, in moisture, completely unnoticed. And among those hidden workers, few are stranger than the tiny gray crustacean curled beneath your garden pot, waiting patiently for the shadow to return so it can continue doing the job it has performed since long before humans ever planted their first garden. So the next time one rolls itself into a perfect little ball in the palm of your hand, remember what you are actually holding. Not a bug, not a pest, but one of the oldest, most resilient, and most misunderstood gardeners on Earth.